Welcome to our discussion on shifts in civil society dynamics in Cambodia. After decades of conflict and transformation, Cambodia's civil society is facing both new challenges and opportunities.
I'm excited to dive in. It's fascinating, right? When you think about how CSOs have evolved post-conflict, it really highlights a lot of layers.
Absolutely. You see, Cambodia's journey from a state of civil war and international isolation to one maturing in democratic practices is really underscored by the way civil society has grown. Even though economic growth has been notable, like 6 to 7% GDP annually, poverty and inequality still persist.
And what's really interesting is how CSOs are now grappling with pro-neoliberal state policies, right?
Yes, exactly. That tension between revitalized state initiatives and the traditional roles of civil society in service delivery, advocacy, and rights protection is at the heart of this discussion. They're evolving their strategies to remain relevant.
So, let me ask, how do you see the shift in the roles of CSOs from just post-conflict reconstruction to that of deeper democratic engagement?
Oh, that's a great question. Initially, CSOs primarily filled service gaps like healthcare and education because the state was overwhelmed. But now we've seen a transition to more complex roles such as facilitating decentralization, promoting accountability, and even engaging in policy dialogue. It's like they're transforming from just service providers to being active participants in democracy building.
Right. And considering that many of these organizations are still heavily reliant on international aid, I wonder, can they really pivot effectively for a sustainable future?
There's definitely a challenge there. Many CSOs indeed depended on donor funding for decades, which naturally sets them up in a sort of dependency trap. But as Cambodia's economy improves, donor funds might decline. So CSOs must recalibrate their strategies, perhaps by forging new alliances with government and even with the private sector. That shift could redefine their operational landscape.
I see. But isn't there a risk that their close relationship with government could undermine their independence? I mean, tackling sensitive issues like human rights demands a critical distance.
That's a valid point. There's a delicate dance here. CSOs want to influence policy and maintain open channels with the government, yet they must preserve their autonomy. Particularly, CSOs working on human rights often face direct pushback from government authorities. They even have to prove their political neutrality continuously while calling out injustices.
Speaking of human rights, it's striking how some CSOs have had to risk retaliation, like in cases where environmental activists have been targeted. How do you see that playing out amidst state pressure?
It's a tough spot. The article mentioned how groups like CCHR and Licado are continuously challenged by the state for daring to critique policies, especially those concerning land concessions and resource extractions. Even though they're essential for checking abuses, they're often labeled as destabilizing forces, which really complicates their work.
Absolutely. And what's also intriguing is how CSOs must handle these internal dynamics. Their relationships aren't just with the state, but also, among themselves.
Correct. The document highlights a fascinating aspect where relationships among CSOs are marked by both cooperation and competition. Networks and coalitions like NGO Forum on Cambodia, CCC, and others act as avenues for learning and resource sharing. But at times, resource asymmetry leads to tensions. Smaller organizations feel patronized by the larger ones. It's almost like a microcosm of broader societal power imbalances.
That intrasector dynamic is really interesting. It almost seems like there's a constant battle between collective solidarity and individual survival.
Yeah, exactly. For instance, a big CSO might end up dominating a network, leaving smaller CSOs to struggle. They even end up with overlapping and sometimes clashing efforts, like the example of competing involvement in community-based organizations.
Right.
It's a bit of friendly rivalry that sometimes turns sour.
And when you layer on the government's assertiveness, especially in areas of decentralization and regulations, there's even more complexity.
Absolutely. The article explains how the government recently attempted to introduce new NGO and associational laws, which CSOs saw as tightening the state's grip. In some cases, the intervention of the Prime Minister even shelved those drafts. This instance shows the ongoing negotiation over governing space.
So, would you say that CSOs need to become more agile and perhaps develop a dual strategy, working with the government in some spheres and remaining independent in others?
Definitely. There's an emerging consensus that for CSOs to remain relevant, they must master the art of both confronting and cooperating with governmental and economic power. For example, while CSOs involved in service delivery enjoy a collaborative rapport with the state, those engaged in advocacy for human rights must essentially operate in a counter-hegemonic space.
Yeah.
Striking that balance is key.
And what about the contribution of international donors? It seems CSOs have long been shaped by donor priorities. Do you think that reliance on external funding hampers their genuine engagement with grassroots issues?
That's a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, donors catalyzed the growth of CSOs post-UNTAC. On the other, it created a scenario where CSOs might focus more on meeting donor requirements rather than addressing local nuances. As international aid shifts, CSOs will have to readjust and become more intrinsically driven by local needs.
But here's something to consider. Some might argue that the infusion of external funding also equipped these organizations with modern management practices and global perspectives. Isn't that a positive side?
True, and I do respect that view. However, there's also the risk that these global frameworks overshadow indigenous approaches. It's like relying too much on a one-size-fits-all model that doesn't capture the unique Cambodian context. This tension is what many scholars and practitioners are grappling with today.
Interesting. And what about civil society's interaction with other sectors like media and academia? The text suggests that these links are underdeveloped in Cambodia.
Yes, exactly. Despite the potential for a stronger partnership, CSOs mostly view media largely as a tool for publicity. Meanwhile, academia suffers because of inadequate research links and outdated curriculum. Strengthening these relationships could enhance the capacity for public outreach and informed policy advocacy.
That makes so much sense. I mean, imagine if CSOs could work closely with academic institutions to research grassroots issues and then use media to bring them to the forefront. Talk about a synergistic approach.
Yeah, it's like a missing puzzle piece in the overall strategy. However, establishing these robust interconnections is easier said than done. There are trust issues and alignment challenges, especially given the politicization of media in Cambodia.
Right. And then there's the private sector angle too, right? The text briefly touches on how CSOs might leverage partnerships with private enterprises for sustainable development.
Exactly. Although the current engagement is limited primarily to critique and confrontation, there are emerging opportunities. If CSOs can partner with socially responsible businesses, they could help in bridging the gap between wealth creation and equitable growth. Yet, finding that path means overcoming deeply entrenched skepticism.
Absolutely. And pivoting to the future, what kinds of capacities do you think CSOs need to cultivate to stay relevant when international aid begins to wane?
They need to invest in both policy analysis and grassroots engagement. Around capacity development in advocacy, legal support, and technical skills to engage with fast-evolving governance models is crucial. Moreover, empowering local leadership, especially among the youth, is vital. This shift could help them tap into the rich local talent pool and embrace a more proactive approach to democracy building.
Totally. And isn't it also about redefining the national interest from the perspective of the citizenry?
Yes, indeed. CSOs must reconnect with the everyday realities of Cambodians, the displacement due to large-scale land concessions, the struggles of small-scale fishers, and so on. This means going beyond service delivery and seriously engaging in policy formulation and advocacy for social justice.
It seems then that the entire landscape is in a state of flux, with CSOs being pressed to balance, multiple roles simultaneously.
Exactly. And that flux, this state of constant negotiation between cooperation and confrontation, is what characterizes the current dynamics. As the government asserts more control and as economic paradigms shift, CSOs have to be agile. Their future will depend on developing relationships across civic, media, academic, and even private sectors.
Yeah, so, in a nutshell, while Cambodia has made impressive strides in rebuilding its civil society, the road ahead is laden with challenges that demand transformative strategies, right?
Precisely. It's like walking a tightrope, balancing past successes in service delivery and reconciliation with the need to innovate and engage in robust democratic activism. The stakes are high because civil society's legitimacy depends on solving grassroots problems and aligning with global democratic standards.
Interestingly, there's a recurring theme of dependency versus autonomy. These CSOs must learn to navigate donor dependency while claiming an independent local voice. Not an easy feat at all.
Absolutely not. And that's why creating internal capacities, research, advocacy, and coalition building is so crucial. It's like, building muscle. It takes time, effort, and the right mix of resources.
Right. And with the added pressure from rapid economic development and increasingly assertive political practices, the clock is ticking for CSOs to innovate.
Yeah, indeed. Relevance in the future demands that CSOs become more proactive in influencing policy and ensuring that the voices of the disenfranchised are heard. This means redefining not only their operational models, but also their relationships with government, media, and the private sector.
I like that perspective. A redefined civil society that is agile, deeply connected with local communities, and yet bold enough to challenge dominant narratives.
Exactly. And as Cambodian CSOs look ahead, they'll need to build, not just isolated strengths, but interdependent networks that can effectively advocate for sustainable, equitable development. That, I think, is the core takeaway.
Yeah, indeed, it's a compelling blueprint for the future of civil society in a rapidly changing Cambodia. Thanks for this engaging conversation. I feel like we just scratched the surface of such a dynamic topic.
Absolutely. There's so much more to explore and debate on these issues. Thanks for the insightful questions and for joining in today.